Oh, sorry about that. All right. So here today we are just going to talk about organelles. Now, for most of us, I think this is going to be a really easy section for the cells unit because it really doesn't change from what you learned in ninth grade or what you learned in seventh grade in middle school. You basically need to know the organelles of a plant and animal cell and what they do, right? So what I would do is just use the PowerPoint slides in this video to go through and look at your textbook and just know the functions of each. Like the mitochondria, powerhouse of the cell, or um, ribosomes make proteins, and that's all we're really talking about. So this is going to be brief, even though there are a lot of different organelles, just because I can't add too much to just knowing what they do. So, like we said, there's prokaryotic cells, but they don't have any organelles, so we can't really talk much about them as far as organelles. And then there's eukaryotic animal and plant cells, and I'll mention kind of the ones that are different from animals and plants in our PowerPoint. So just remember, like we said, most bacteria are prokaryotes, sorry about that, are much, much smaller, like 10 times smaller than most eukaryotic cells. And no wonder they can't fit all that stuff inside. So, why we're studying cells and their organelles is cells are the smallest building blocks of life. They make up tissues, which make up organs, which make up bodies. And so all bodies are made up of cells. Our bodies have anywhere between 10 and 100 trillion cells in them. So cells do a whole bunch of different jobs, such as breathing, exchange gases, oxygen in and CO2 out. They take in and digest food and turn it into energy, which in the case of our cells is ATP. They build molecules like proteins and carbohydrates and fats and nucleic acids through dehydration synthesis, like we talked about in the chemistry of life. And they remove waste, like carbon dioxide. And then they control the internal conditions to maintain homeostasis, or that small balance of conditions that are conducive to life. And they need to respond to external stimuli. So if something on the outside is attacking it, it can respond to that. Or if the external conditions, there's a lot of glucose, it can take that into the cell. And then they need to reproduce or build more cells to replace and replenish those that are damaged that die. So the jobs of the cells can be broken down into three main categories. To make energy, to make proteins, and to make more cells. So the unit after this, cellular energetics, is all about this, making energy. Part of our genetics unit is all about this, making proteins. And then kind of in between our cells unit and the cellular energetics unit, kind of unit 2.5, is going to be about this, making more cells, making growth, mitosis and meiosis. The cells organelles do all of these jobs. And so when we look at the overview now, we can point different organelles to these different jobs. But more importantly, when we study each of these main jobs in more detail, we will be focusing on a complement of organelles that help that to occur. So here's a model of an animal cell. And organelles do the work of the cell. They're specialized structures that do one job really, really well that contributes to the homeostasis and the survivability of that cell. Yeah, but that's a interesting picture. Sorry if it's not very understandable, but I thought it looked something like a cell. So number one, cells need power, and that is kind of the job of some different organelles. So it needs to be able to fuel daily life and growth, to take in food, to take in oxygen, to make ATP, to remove waste, And so organelles like the cell membrane, the lysosomes, the vacuoles and vesicles, and the mitochondria all help in making power, in providing energy. So first, the cell membrane. The cell membrane separates the cell, the inside from the outside, and in the next video we're going to talk a lot more about the cell membrane. It controls what enters and what leaves the cell, so what's able to make it in and what out and what can't. So for example, oxygen, carbon dioxide, food, water, nutrients, waste, all that stuff. And it recognizes and signals other cells. It's made up of a double layer of fat, a phospholipid bilayer that we're going to talk a lot more about in the next video, so I won't go into it here. And it has receptor molecules embedded into it, proteins mainly, that can receive and transmit signals. So there is, in red, the cell membrane. And the cytoplasm, that jelly-like material on the inside, separating inside and outside. Vacuoles are like small little buds of phospholipid bilayer that float around on the inside of the cell. And their job is to move material around the cell, or as storage. So there's a vesicle. And they're like a big sac of the plasma membrane that's pinched off that can now travel around and speed around the cell with different stuff inside of it. They can also be filled with special enzymes to help break apart and digest things, right? Such as in the case of lysosomes that we'll talk about later. In plants, they can store food and water as well. So like in a plant cell, there's a large central vacuole that maintains the water balance by filling itself full of water or starch, or shrinking down and removing that starch. And in animal cells, there's food vacuoles that store food and nutrients that can be used later. So if you look now surrounded in red, those are the vacuoles and the vesicles in the cytoplasm. And the cell membrane that we talked about already. Lysosomes are kind of a special vesicle that contain enzymes that digest food and clean up and recycle other waste products that they don't want to take up space anymore. And so just like vesicles, they're made up of membrane-bound sacs, but they have special digestive enzymes to break up food and break down old organelles and dead material, or possibly, like in white blood cells, invading pathogens. So here's kind of a picture of those lysosomes breaking down food or other waste products. One of the jobs for lysosomes is actually to remove the webbing that is between your fingers. So when you are a 6-week-old fetus, your hand kind of looks like a club-like thing that has webbing in between the fingers, and the lysosomes break apart that that tissue that conjoins the fingers, kind of like this. Sometimes, when things don't develop as they should, babies and people are born with them still fused together, and that was a failure of those lysosomes and those cells to do their job. So here's our picture, and now we highlighted a red lysosome that's for digestion and garbage disposal. We got the vacuoles and the cell membrane and the cytoplasm. We also have the mitochondria that make ATP energy, so it's the powerhouse of the cell by converting oxygen and sugars into energy that allow the cell to have fuel to do all the cool stuff it needs to do. And it is a double membrane organelle because it was previously a prokaryote that was incorporated via endosymbiosis, so it's double membrane. And they are found in both animals and plant cells. And we'll talk much more about mitochondria when we talk about cellular energetics and cellular respiration. So now we'll add our mitochondria right there. Plants also have another way of producing energy. They have mitochondria just like animal cells, but they also have chloroplasts, which are these green things. That's what makes a plant green, is the chlorophyll and the chloroplasts that make energy and sugar from sunlight in photosynthesis. And we'll talk much more about these in the photosynthesis part of cellular energetics. And photosynthesis kind of is the reverse of cellular respiration. It turns sunlight and carbon dioxide into ATP energy and sugar. So these little green things are the chloroplasts, the sacs where that happened. And we'll go more into photosynthesis in our next unit. So please remember, mitochondria are in both plant cells over here and animal cells. They both have them. But only plant cells have chloroplasts, not animal cells. Important distinction. So here's the cytoplasm of a plant cell, and the cell membrane, and the cell wall, and there's that giant central vacuole that we said can store food and water and waste, the lysosome, mitochondria, and a chloroplast. Cells also need workers. They need proteins. To make proteins, to run daily life and growth, cells must read genes, build proteins for structure, for enzymes, to signal for hormones. The organelles that do that are the nucleus, the ribosomes, and the endoplasmic reticulum. So, proteins do all the work in a cell, and one of the major jobs of cells is to make proteins because proteins do all the work. From DNA to proteins to cells. So, the nucleus of the cell, its job is the control center of the cell, and it stores and protects the DNA, that genetic information, so that it doesn't get ruined and degraded. DNA is the raw instructions to build proteins. The nucleus has a nuclear membrane like a mini plasma membrane, a nucleolus, the area in which RNA is made within the nucleus, and the chromosomes. That's where the DNA is kind of stored, the structure it's stored in, those long chromosomes. So here is our cell, and there is the nucleus, the nuclear envelope. And there, that little dot, that is the nucleolus that produces the ribosomes and the RNA. And those little black things are the chromosomes, that's the DNA. Now the ribosomes themselves. They are the place where the proteins are actually made at, the protein factories that read the instructions to build proteins from DNA, or, more literally RNA. Some are free, floating around in the cytoplasm, and some are attached to the endoplasmic reticulum right here. The free ribosomes usually synthesize proteins that are going to be used in the cell, and the attached ribosomes are usually going to make proteins that get shipped out of the cell to be used somewhere else. So back to our cell picture. All these red little dots in the cytoplasm and on the ER, those are the ribosomes. Remember, ribosomes are found in prokaryotes too, just different types, but they are as well found in prokaryotes. And then we have the endoplasmic reticulum. This works on proteins and helps to complete the proteins after they're built and ship them out of the cell. The endoplasmic reticulum also replenishes the cell membrane. There's a rough ER called rough because it has proteins that, or not proteins, but ribosomes that are attached to it. And it has the smooth ER because it's smooth. There's no ribosome attached to it, which makes more of the plasma membrane. So here you can see kind of the nuclear envelope and the rough and the smooth ER in a closer microscopic image of them. The rough ER here, the smooth ER here. You can notice there's no ribosomes on the smooth ER. And so here in our picture, all of that is the endoplasmic reticulum. It's like a big roadway of moving things about the cell from getting to the nucleus out to the plasma membrane and also transporting those proteins made on the bound ribosomes out of the cell. And lastly, there's the Golgi apparatus, this little weird structure that looks like that finishes, sorts, labels, ships, manufactures, kind of finishes off proteins that were made in the rough ER before they go out of the cell. So it's kind of like the shipping headquarters. And it ships proteins and vesicles to the plasma membrane where through exocytosis they'll leave the cell. It's a membranous sac that contains different enzymes, hydrolytic enzymes that can kind of finish up the protein, cut things off, add things to it so it's in its final form to be able to be used. And so it is found right here in our cell. So the nucleus with DNA stored in chromosomes makes RNA, which then can be turned into proteins. We have the endoplasmic reticulum with the ribosomes where the proteins are actually made on. So we'll talk more about that during the genetics unit. And then we have the smooth ER, which can transport those proteins that might need to be shipped out of the cell through vesicles. That will travel to the Golgi apparatus to kind of finish them off before they are eventually excreted from the cell. So this is kind of the pathway of a typical secretory protein from DNA through the ribosomes in the rough and smooth endoplasmic reticulum to the smooth ER out of the cell. All right, if it was a protein that needed to stay in the cell, instead of a bound ribosome, it would be made on a free ribosome and then just be floating here free in the cell to be used in something the cell would need it to do. Protein on its way. All right, so here's all those parts that we talked about in a plant cell too. So here's the nucleus, the nucleolus, there the ribosomes, and the endoplasmic reticulum, and the Golgi apparatus, just so we can have examples from both animals and plant cells and kind of know the difference. And lastly, cells need to make more cells. So making more cells to replace, repair, and grow. They must copy their DNA. They must make a whole extra set of organelles for the new cell and divide the DNA and new organelles between the new daughter cells. And this is in the process of mitosis that we'll talk about later on in a different unit. The organelles that do this work are the nucleus and the centrioles. And we've already talked about the nucleus already, so we'll focus on the centrioles. The centrioles are these weird star aster-shaped type of things, and they help coordinate the cell division, so they become crucial in mitosis, and that's why we'll talk a lot more about them later when we talk about mitosis. But they are only found in animal cells. Important. There's one pair of them for each cell, and they create kind of the spindly fibers. Well, actually, they're called spindle fibers that separate the chromosomes in mitosis. But don't worry about that at this point. We'll talk about mitosis later in days to come. Right now, we just need to know that they help coordinate cell division. So here they are right there, the centrioles. So this is all of the organelles I really want you to know about here in one simple diagram. So just a summary. They have cells have three main jobs: to make energy, to make proteins, and to make more cells. And all of the organelles that we talk about are related to those three jobs, and all organelles in general are related to those three jobs. All right. So if you have any questions, you can let me know now or during the asynchronous session. I would use the chart that's in your book on this PowerPoint to review kind of the organelles that you need to know and the level that you need to know them to. I kind of, in this PowerPoint, describe them to the level that you need to be able to know their structures and functions. So it should be just a matter of just kind of looking back over that.